Welcome back to Footnotes and Folly and to Josephus. I am Pemberton. This is part 1 to 4. Before the battering rams begin their work, Josephus the historian pauses to set the stage, and gives us one of the great descriptions of antiquity. He walks us round the city of Jerusalem, its 3 encircling walls, the deep valleys that guard it, and the mighty towers Hippicus, Phasaelus, and Mariamne that Herod raised. Then he leads us up to the heart of it all, the temple and the courts, the cloisters, the golden gate and the whitened gold sanctuary, the priests and their vestments and the rites within. It is the most beautiful thing in the book, and we are about to watch it burn. Let us continue.
Jerusalem was fortified with 3 walls in the parts that were not surrounded by impassable valleys. In the places where such valleys protected it, the city had only 1 wall. The city was built on 2 hills facing one another, with a valley dividing them. The rows of houses on both hills ended at this valley. Of these hills, the one that contains the upper city is much higher and runs in a straighter line. King David, the father of Solomon who first built the temple, called it the citadel, but we call it the upper market place. The other hill, called a crag, supports the lower city and has the shape of a horned moon. Opposite this was a 3rd hill, naturally lower than a crag, and formerly separated from the other by a broad valley. But during the reign of the Asamoneans, they filled that valley with earth because they wanted to join the city to the temple. They also cut down part of a crag's height and made it lower than before, so that the temple might stand above it. The Valley of the Cheesemongers, as it was called, was the valley I have already said separated the hill of the upper city from that of the lower city. It extended as far as Siloam, the name of a fountain whose water is sweet and also plentiful. On the outer sides, these hills are surrounded by deep valleys, and because of the precipices on both sides, they are everywhere impassable. Of the 3 walls, the old wall was hard to capture both because of the valleys and because of the hill on which it was built, rising above them. Besides this great advantage of location, it was also very strongly built, because David, Solomon, and the later kings were very zealous about this work. This wall began on the north at the tower called Hippicus and extended as far as the place called the Xystus. Then, joining the council house, it ended at the west cloister of the temple. If we go the other way, westward, it began at the same place and extended through a place called Bethso to the gate of the Essens. After that it went southward, bending above the fountain Siloam, where it also bent again toward the east at Solomon's pool, and reached as far as a place called Ophelis, where it joined the eastern cloister of the temple. The 2nd wall began at the gate called Genath, which belonged to the 1st wall. It enclosed only the northern quarter of the city and reached as far as the tower Antonia. The 3rd wall began at the tower Hippicus. From there it reached as far as the northern quarter of the city and the tower Cephanus, and then extended until it came opposite the monuments of Helena, who was queen of Adiabene and daughter of Isates. It then stretched much farther, passed by the sepulchral caverns of the kings, bent again at the corner tower by the monument called the Monument of the Fuller, and joined the old wall at the valley called the Valley of Cedron. It was Agrippa who surrounded with this wall the parts added to the old city, which before had been entirely exposed. As the city became more populous, it gradually crept beyond its old limits. The parts north of the temple joined that hill to the city, made the city considerably larger, and caused the 4th hill, called Bezetha, to be inhabited as well. This hill lies opposite the tower Antonia, but is divided from it by a deep valley that was dug on purpose. The purpose was to prevent the foundations of the tower of Antonia from joining this hill, which would have made it easy to approach the tower and would have lessened the security that came from its superior height. For this reason also, the depth of the ditch made the elevation of the towers more striking. This newly built part of the city was called Bezetha in our language, which in Greek may be translated as the new city. Since the inhabitants of this area needed protection, Agrippa, the father of the present king and bearing the same name, began the wall I have mentioned. But after laying only the foundations, he stopped building it because he feared Claudius Caesar might suspect that so strong a wall was being built to support some change in public affairs. If that wall had been finished in the way it was begun, the city could not have been taken by any means. Its parts were joined together with stones 20 cubits long and 10 cubits wide, which could never have been easily undermined with iron tools or shaken by engines. The wall was 10 cubits wide, and would probably have been higher than that if the zeal of the man who began it had not been hindered. Afterward the Jews raised it with great diligence to a height of 20 cubits. Above that were battlements of 2 cubits and turrets, 3 cubits high, so that the whole height reached 25 cubits. Towers on this wall were 20 cubits wide and 20 cubits high. They were square and solid, like the wall itself, and the precision of their joints and the beauty of their stones were in no way inferior to those of the Holy House. Above the solid part of each tower, which was 20 cubits high, were rooms of great magnificence. Above those were upper rooms and cisterns to receive rainwater. There were many towers, and the steps by which one ascended to them were all broad. The 3rd wall had 90 towers, with 200 cubits between each. The middle wall had 40 towers, and the old wall was divided by 60. The whole circumference of the city was 3 furlongs. The entire third wall was wonderful, but the tower Cephanus rose above it at the northwest corner, where Titus pitched his own tent. Since it was 70 cubits high, it gave a view of Arabia at sunrise, and of the farthest limits of the Hebrew possessions toward the sea in the west. It was octagonal. Opposite it stood the tower Hippicus, and near Hippicus 2 other towers had been built by King Herod in the old wall. In size, beauty, and strength, these surpassed all towers in the habitable earth. Besides the greatness of Herod's nature and the magnificence he showed toward the city on other occasions, he built these towers in such an extraordinary way to satisfy his private affections. He dedicated them to the memory of the 3 people dearest to him, and named the towers after them: his brother, his friend, and his wife. He had killed his wife because of his love and jealousy, as we have already related. The other 2 he lost in war, while they were fighting courageously. Hippicus, named after his friend, was square. Its length and breadth were each 25 cubits, and its height was 30 cubits, with no hollow space inside. Above this solid structure, which was made of great stones joined together, there was a reservoir 20 cubits deep. Above the reservoir stood a 2-story house, 25 cubits high and divided into several parts. Above that were battlements of 2 cubits and turrets all around 3 cubits high, so that the total height added together came to 80 cubits. The second tower, named by Herod after his brother Phasaelus, had equal breadth and height, each 40 cubits. Above this was its solid height of 40 cubits, and above that a cloister ran around it, 10 cubits high, protected from enemies by breastworks and bulwarks. Above this cloister another tower was built, divided into magnificent rooms, and a place for bathing, so that this tower lacked nothing that might make it appear to be a royal palace. It was also adorned with more battlements and turrets than the previous tower, and its whole height was about 90 cubits. Its appearance resembled the Tower of Pharos, which showed a fire to those sailing to Alexandria, but it was much larger in circumference. It had now been turned into a house where Simon exercised his tyrannical authority. The third tower was Mariamne, for that was the name of Herod's queen. It was solid to a height of 20 cubits. Its breadth and length were each 20 cubits and equal to one another. Its upper buildings were more magnificent, and had more variety than those of the other towers, because the king thought it most fitting to adorn the tower named after his wife better than those named after men, while the towers named after men were built stronger than the one bearing his wife's name. The total height of this tower was 50 cubits. Since these towers were already very tall, they appeared much taller because of the place where they stood. The very old wall in which they were built stood on a high hill, and this hill itself formed a further elevation of 30 cubits. The towers stood above this, and so appeared much higher. The size of the stones was also wonderful. They were not made of common small stones, nor merely of stones so large that men could carry them, but of white marble cut from the rock. Each stone was 20 cubits long, 10 cubits wide, and 5 cubits deep. They were joined so exactly to one another that each tower looked like one whole natural rock of stone, afterward cut by the hands of craftsmen into its present shape and corners. Their joints and connections were hardly visible, or not visible at all. Below these towers, on the north side of the wall, the king had a palace joined to it on the inside. This palace surpasses all my ability to describe it. It was so elaborate that neither expense nor skill was lacking in its construction. It was completely surrounded by a wall 30 cubits high, and was adorned with towers placed at equal intervals. It had large bedchambers, each capable of holding beds for 100 guests. The variety of the stones in it cannot be expressed, for a large quantity of rare stones of that kind had been gathered together. Its roofs were also wonderful, both for the length of the beams and for the splendor of their ornaments. The number of rooms was very great, and the variety of the figures around them was extraordinary. Their furniture was complete, and the greater part of the vessels placed in them was made of silver and gold. There were also many porticos, one beyond another, all around, and in each of those porticos were finely made pillars. All the courts open to the air were everywhere green. There were also several groves of trees, with long walks through them, deep canals and cisterns. In several places these were filled with bronze statues through which the water flowed. Around the canals there were also many courts for tame pigeons. But truly it is not possible to give a complete description of these palaces. The very memory of them is a torment, because it reminds one what immensely rich buildings were consumed by the fire kindled by the robbers. These were not burned by the Romans, but by the internal plotters, as we have already related, at the beginning of their rebellion. That fire began at the Tower of Antonia, went on to the palaces, and consumed the upper parts of the 3 towers themselves. This temple, as I have already said, was built on a strong hill. At first the level space on top was hardly large enough for the holy house and the altar, because the ground around it was very uneven and like a precipice. But when King Solomon, the man who built the temple, had built a wall for it on the east side, one cloister was added there, founded on a bank that had been thrown up for it. On the other sides the holy house still stood exposed. In later ages the people added new banks, and the hill became a broader plain. They then broke down the wall on the north side, and took in enough ground for the full circuit of the temple. After they had built walls around 3 sides of the temple from the bottom of the hill, and had completed a work greater than anyone could have hoped for, spending long ages on it and exhausting all their sacred treasures, which were continually replenished by tributes sent to God from the whole habitable earth, they surrounded their upper courts with cloisters, just as they afterward did the lowest court of the temple. The lowest part was raised to a height of 300 cubits, and in some places more. Yet the full depth of the foundations did not appear, because they brought in earth and filled the valleys, wanting to make them level with the narrow streets of the city. In this work they used stones 40 cubits in size. The great abundance of money they then had, together with the liberality of the people, made this attempt succeed to an incredible degree. What could not even have been hoped ever to be accomplished was brought to perfection by perseverance and length of time. The works above these foundations were not unworthy of them. All the cloisters were double, and the pillars belonging to them, which supported the cloisters, were 25 cubits high. Each pillar was one whole stone, and that stone was white marble. The roofs were adorned with cedar, skillfully carved. The natural magnificence, excellent polish, and harmony of the joints in these cloisters made a very remarkable sight, and their exterior was not adorned by any work of painter or engraver. The cloisters of the outermost court were 30 cubits wide, while the whole circuit measured 6 furlongs, including the Tower of Antonia. All the courts that were open to the air were paved with stones of every kind. When one passed through these first cloisters into the second court of the temple, there was a stone partition all around it, 3 cubits high. Its construction was very elegant. On it stood pillars at equal intervals, declaring the law of purity, some in Greek and some in Roman letters, that no foreigner should go within that sanctuary. For the second court of the temple was called the sanctuary, and it was reached from the first court by 14 steps. This court was 4 square and had its own wall around it. Though the height of its buildings on the outside was 40 cubits, this was hidden by the steps. On the inside the height was only 25 cubits. Since it was built against a higher part of the hill with steps, the full height could not be seen within, because it was covered by the hill itself. Beyond these 13 steps, there was a level space of 10 cubits. From their other steps, each 5 cubits high, led to the gates. On the north and south sides there were 8 gates, 4 on each side, and by necessity there were 2 on the east. Because a partition had been built on that side for the women, as the proper place where they were to worship, a second gate was needed for them. This gate was cut through its wall opposite the first gate. On the other sides there was also one southern gate and one northern gate through which there was passage into the court of the women. The women were not allowed to pass through the other gates, and even when they went through their own gate, they could not go beyond their own wall. This place was allotted equally to the women of our own country, and to women from other countries, provided they belonged to the same nation. The western part of this court had no gate at all, but the wall was built solid on that side. The cloisters between the gates extended inward from the wall, in front of the chambers, supported by very fine and large pillars. These cloisters were single, and except for their size, they were in no way inferior to those of the lower court. 9 of these gates were covered on every side with gold and silver, as were their door jambs and lintels. But there was one gate outside the inward court of the holy house that was made of Corinthian brass, and it greatly surpassed those that were only covered with silver and gold. Each gate had 2 doors. Each door was 30 cubits high and 15 cubits wide. Inside, however, they had large spaces of 30 cubits, and on each side they had rooms built like towers, equal in breadth and length, and more than 40 cubits high. 2 pillars also supported these rooms, each pillar 12 cubits in circumference. The other gates were equal to one another in size, but the gate above the Corinthian gate, which opened on the east opposite the gate of the holy house itself, was much larger. Its height was 50 cubits, and its doors were 40 cubits. It was adorned in the most costly way, with far richer and thicker plates of silver and gold than the others. Alexander, the father of Tiberius, had poured the silver and gold over these 9 gates. 15 steps led away from the wall of the court of the women to this greater gate, while the steps that led there from the other gates were 5 steps shorter. As for the holy house itself, which stood in the middle of the innermost court, the most sacred part of the temple, it was reached by 12 steps. At the front, its height and breadth were equal, each being 100 cubits, though at the back it was 40 cubits narrower. On its front it had what may be called shoulders on each side, extending 20 cubits farther. Its first gate was 70 cubits high and 25 cubits wide. This gate had no doors, because it represented the universal visibility of heaven, and the fact that heaven cannot be shut out from any place. Its front was entirely covered with gold, and through it the first, more inward part of the house could be seen. Because that inner part was very large, all the parts around the more inward gate appeared to shine to those who saw them. But since the whole house was divided into 2 parts inside, only the first part was open to view. This first part extended throughout to a height of 90 cubits, with a length of 50 cubits, and a breadth of 20. The gate at the end of this first part of the house, as already observed, was completely covered with gold, as was the whole wall around it. Above it were golden vines, from which clusters of grapes hung as tall as a man. Since this house was divided into 2 parts, the inner part was lower than the outer appearance. It had golden doors 55 cubits high and 16 cubits wide. Before these doors hung a veil of the same size as the doors. It was a Babylonian curtain embroidered with blue, fine linen, scarlet, and purple, and woven in a truly wonderful manner. This mixture of colors was not without a mystical meaning, but was a kind of image of the universe. By the scarlet, fire seemed to be symbolically signified, by the fine flax the earth, by the blue the air, and by the purple the sea. Two of these had a resemblance by their colors, while the fine flax and the purple had their foundation in their origin, since the earth produces the one and the sea produces the other. This curtain also had embroidered on it all that was mystical in the heavens, except for the 12 signs representing living creatures. When anyone entered the temple, its floor received him. This part of the temple was therefore 60 cubits high and the same in length, while its breadth was only 20 cubits. Yet that 60 cubits of length was divided again. The first part was cut off at 40 cubits and contained 3 things very wonderful and famous among all mankind: the candlestick, the table of showbread, and the altar of incense. The 7 lamps signified the 7 planets, because that was how many branches came out of the candlestick. The 12 loaves on the table signified the circle of the zodiac and the year. The altar of incense, with its 13 kinds of sweets, smelling spices, which the sea supplied, signified that God possesses all things in both the uninhabitable and habitable parts of the earth, and that all are to be dedicated to his use. The innermost part of the whole temple was 20 cubits. It too was separated from the outer part by a veil. There was nothing at all inside it. It was inaccessible, inviolable, and not to be seen by anyone, and it was called the Holy of Holies. Around the sides of the lower part of the temple were small houses, with passages from one into another. There were many of them, and they were 3 stories high. There were also entrances into them from the gate of the temple on each side. But the upper part of the temple had no such small houses beyond this, because the temple was narrower there, 40 cubits higher, and of a smaller body than its lower parts. Thus we conclude that the whole height, including the 60 cubits from the floor, amounted to 100 cubits. The outward face of the temple at the front lacked nothing that could astonish either the mind or the eyes of men. It was covered all over with heavy plates of gold, and at the first rising of the sun it reflected back such a fiery splendor that those who forced themselves to look at it had to turn their eyes away, just as they would from the rays of the sun itself. To strangers approaching from a distance, the temple appeared like a mountain covered with snow, because the parts that were not gilded were exceedingly white. On its top it had spikes with sharp points to prevent any pollution from birds sitting on it. Some of its stones were 45 cubits long, 5 cubits high, and 6 cubits wide. Before this temple stood the altar, 15 cubits high and equal in length and breadth, each dimension being 50 cubits. It was built as a square and had corners like horns. The way up to it was by a gentle slope. It was formed without any iron tool, and no iron tool ever touched it at any time. There was also a partition wall about a cubit high, made of fine stones, and pleasing to the sight. This wall surrounded the holy house and the altar and kept the people outside away from the priests. Moreover, those who had gonorrhea or leprosy were excluded entirely from the city. Women also, when their courses were upon them, were shut out of the temple, and even when free from that impurity they were not allowed to go beyond the limit already mentioned. Men who were not thoroughly pure were forbidden to enter the inner court of the temple. Even the priests themselves, if they were not pure, were forbidden to enter it. All those who belonged to the priestly stock, but could not minister, because of some bodily defect, came within the partition together with those who had no such imperfection. Because they belonged to the same stock, they shared with them, but they used only their own private garments. No one wore the sacred garments except the man who was actually officiating. The priests who had no blemish went up to the altar clothed in fine linen. They chiefly abstained from wine, fearing that otherwise they might violate some rule of their ministry. The high priest also went up with them, though not always. He did so on the 7th days, on new moons, and whenever any of the festivals belonging to our nation, which we celebrate every year, took place. When he officiated, he wore a pair of breeches that reached from beneath his private parts to his thighs. He also wore an inner garment of linen, together with a blue garment that was round, seamless, fringed, and reached down to the feet. Golden bells hung on the fringes, with pomegranates mixed among them. The bells signified thunder, and the pomegranates signified lightning. The girdle that fastened the garment to the breast was embroidered in 5 rows with various colors: gold, purple, scarlet, fine linen, and blue. These were the same colors with which, as we have already said, the veils of the temple were embroidered. The ephod had similar embroidery, but it contained a greater amount of gold. Its shape was like a breastpiece for the chest. On it were 2 golden buttons shaped like small shields, which fastened the ephod to the garment. In these buttons were enclosed 2 very large and excellent sardonyxes, engraved with the names of the tribes of that nation. On the other part hung 12 stones, arranged 3 in one direction and 4 in the other: a sardius, a topaz, and an emerald, a carbuncle, a jasper, and a sapphire, an agate, an amethyst, and a ligure, an onyx, a beryl, and a chrysolite. On each of these stones was again engraved one of the names of the tribes already mentioned. A mitre of fine linen also surrounded his head, and was tied with a blue ribbon. Around this was another crown of gold, on which was engraved the sacred name of God, consisting of 4 vowels. The high priest did not wear these garments at other times, but used a plainer dress. He wore them only when he entered the most sacred part of the temple, which he did only once a year, on the day when our custom is for all of us to keep a fast to God. So much, then, concerning the city and the temple. As for the customs and laws connected with these things, we shall speak more exactly at another time, for many matters relating to them remain that have not been touched on here. The Tower of Antonia stood at the corner of two cloisters of the temple court, the western cloister and the northern one. It was built on a rock 50 cubits high and stood over a great precipice. It was the work of King Herod, and in it he showed his natural greatness of spirit. First, the rock itself was covered from its foundation with smooth pieces of stone, both for ornament and so that anyone trying either to climb up or go down it would not be able to get a foothold. Next to this, before one reached the building of the tower itself, there was a wall 3 cubits high. Within that wall, the whole space of the Tower of Antonia itself was built up to a height of 40 cubits. The inner parts had the size and form of a palace, being divided into all kinds of rooms and conveniences, such as courts, bathing places, and broad spaces for camps. Because it contained all the conveniences that cities need, it might have seemed to be made up of several cities, but because of its magnificence, it seemed to be a palace. And just as the whole structure resembled a tower, it also contained 4 distinct towers at its 4 corners. 3 of these were only 50 cubits high, while the tower on the southeast corner was 70 cubits high, so that from it the whole temple could be viewed. At the corner where Antonia joined the 2 cloisters of the temple, it had passages down into both. Through these passages the guard, for a Roman legion always lay in this tower, went in different directions among the cloisters with their arms during the Jewish festivals, in order to watch the people and prevent them from attempting any innovation there. The temple was a fortress guarding the city, just as the Tower of Antonia was a guard to the temple, and in that tower were the guards of those 3. There was also a separate fortress belonging to the upper city, namely Herod's palace. As for the hill Bezetha, it was divided from the Tower Antonia, as we have already said. Since the hill on which the Tower of Antonia stood was the highest of these 3, it adjoined the new city, and was the only place that blocked the view of the temple from the north. This will be enough for the present concerning the city and its surrounding walls, because I have set myself to give a more exact description of it elsewhere.
And we will halt there, having walked the walls and stood within the temple while it still stood whole. Next time, in part 25, the siege begins in earnest, the tyrant Simon and John, the wounding of Nicanor, the Roman banks and battering rams, and the storming of the first and second walls. Mind the footnotes, and beware the folly.